Chapter 3, Albert Purdy again. In his first annual report on the superintendent of the colony for epileptics, as it was then called, Dr. Purdy enthusiastically endorsed the eugenics movement. In the report, the colony's official annual statement to government officials, the medical profession, and the public at large, he was blunt about why he supported eugenics. He thought it was the best way to rid the world of patients he spent all his day ministering to. Epileptics were, Dr. Purdy declared, among, quote, the most pitiful, helpless, and troublesome of the human beings. Of all the known causes of epilepsy, he said, quote, that of bad heredity is the most potent. He recommended marriage restrictions on epileptics to prevent them from increasing their kind. The next year, Dr. Purdy went further and used his annual report to endorse eugenic sterilization. He warned of an impending rapid increase in, quote, epileptics and mental defectives. It was time, he said, quote, to call the attention of our lawmakers to the consideration of legalizing eugenics for the prevention of this growing blight on Virginia's population, end quote. Dr. Purdy once again argued restricting marriages of epileptics, as well as of the insane, the feeble-minded, and, quote, the confirmed alcoholics. This time, however, he was suggested permitting sterilization of inmates in such cases as it was deemed proper, end quote. Dr. Purdy returned frequently to the subject of eugenics. In his 1915 annual report, he warned that without radical measures to curb the feeble-minded from reproducing, it would, quote, be only a matter of time before the resulting pauperism and criminality would, quote, be a burden be too heavy to bear. Until the state sterilized defective people, Dr. Purdy saw institutionalization as important as to protect society. In a 1916 letter, he argued that segregating epileptics could prevent reproduction by, quote, these afflicted and troublesome burdens on our population. Man, how much time do these people got to emphasize this? As much as Dr. Purdy supported segregation of defective people, he believed it was not an adequate response to the threat they posed. There were not enough institutions in Virginia to hold them all, in his view, and it was not likely there would ever be. Without, quote, a great increase in tax rate, he said, the state could not afford institutionalization. All the, quote, antisocial women and girls in the state would likely reproduce defective children. Dr. Purdy argued for a combination of segregation and sterilization, which he called the clearinghouse model. In this approach, young women with hereditary defects would be identified and sent to institutions like the colony. When they arrived, they would be given educational, institutional, and moral training. Once they were properly instructed, the young woman would be sterilized and then safely released into society again. By sterilizing and releasing many women rather than holding a few women until their reproductive cycle ended, Dr. Purdy argued his model would lead to many more women being sterilized, receiving the state of an enormous financial burden, he quoted. There was a third superintendent who joined in Dr. Purdy and Dr. Jenarnet's campaign, Dr. William F. Drury, who ran the Central State Hospital for Negroes in Petersburg, publicly endorsed sterilization in 1912. Dr. Drury, who was white, added a racial element to the discussion by focusing on what he argued as the particular threat posed by feeble-minded black people. He warned that feeble-minded blacks were increasing in numbers and that, quote, the presence of such individuals is a perpetual menace, a constant source of trouble and danger. Ooh, jeez. Dr. Drury believed the answer lay in preventing the feeble-minded from reproducing. quote, by the relentless hand of science under sanction and authority of law. Like other doctors across the country, Dr. Priddy appears to have sterilized people before it was authorized by law. In his first few years at the colony, he began performing procedures that were, as a legal historian Paul Lombardo has argued, almost certainly eugenic sterilizations, even though they were not described that way. In his 1915 annual report, Dr. Priddy said the colony had performed an operation on a young man for belief of a chronic pelvic disorder, which sterilized her. The woman was then permanently discharged from the colony. In a few years, an extraordinary number of women at the colony were diagnosed with vague, quote, pelvic diseases and ended up being sterilized. In 1916, Dr. Priddy and Dr. John Arnett began a campaign to persuade the state legislature to enact a eugenic sterilization law. They had missed the first national wave, which peaked in 1913, when 6 state legislators adopted sterilization statutes, 4 of which were signed into law. Now, however, 6 years after Dr. Carrington's bill failed, there was growing support in Virginia, particularly in University of Virginia and among administrators of the state's mental hospitals. Dr. John Arnett and Dr. Priddy approached the state senator they believed would be sympathetic and asked if he would draft a bill. The state senator, Audrey Strode, was a friend of Dr. Priddy, who had been pivotal in founding the colony. He drafted the bill, but it was not the kind of bold eugenic sterilization law other states had passed. Strode's bill, which became law, did not directly authorize sterilization or mention eugenics. Instead, it gave superintendents of state hospitals for the feeble-minded authority to provide inmates, quote, such moral, medical, and surgical treatment as they deemed, quote, proper. The, quote, moral, medical, and surgical treatment language in Strode's law was vague, but it was left superintendents room to claim that any sterilization they performed was authorized. Dr. Priddy was quick to do just that, asserting that, quote, a logical and plain construction of the newly enacted statute permitted him to sterilize feeble-minded inmates at the colony. His reading was, as even Dr. John Arnett a, quote, broad and liberal interpretation of the law. When the 1916 law took effect, Dr. Priddy began open performing sterilizations. In his next annual report, he made reference to a group of feeble-minded women who had been sterilized. They had been released, he said, and were almost without exception doing well in the outside world. The next year, Dr. Priddy sterilized 30 women, and he offered up the same excuse. We have continued the policy of sterilizing young women and girls of the moron type, he reported, and in nearly all cases sterilized, the pelvic disease was found in a greater and lesser degree, just such as to make the removal of the tubes necessary for the relief of the physical suffering. Euphemism for you. Colony records suggested another reason for the sterilization. Dr. Priddy described most of the women as feeble-minded, but he generally also included a reference to their being overly sexual. They were, quote, immoral, and, quote, oversexed and man-crazy, in his words. And he made references to their purported histories of prostitution or promiscuity. The woman's clinical diagnosis included such conditions as, quote, sexual degeneracy and nymphomania. These were traits Dr. Priddy believed that had to be genetically removed from the population. It was only a matter of time before Dr. Priddy's aggressive program of sterilization under the vague authority of the new law got him into trouble. The source of the trouble was Willie Mallory, a 38-year-old mother of 9. Willie had come to the colony after being arrested at the home in Richmond, and charged with running a house of prostitution. Mallory's had experienced setbacks over the years, but at the time of her arrest, her husband, George, was working as a sawmill, and Willie had a factory job. Willie was also generally acknowledged to be a good mother. When she was arrested, she had a baby in her arms. Willie's arrest led to her being fraught brought before a commission of feeble-mindedness with two of her daughters, Jessie and Nanny. Willie would later testify that the hearing was anything but scientific. The doctor who examined her asked foolish questions, she said, such as whether she could tell if there was salt in bread and if she knew how to tie her shoes. When Willie was found to be feeble-minded, she insisted that the hearing was rigged.